Reach, Young Adult Ministry Sermons, online from Tuesday, November 5th, 2019, by Armando Gonzalez, pastor to students at Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from the series 1 Samuel, entitled Mercy, Mercy, from 1 Samuel 24.
Well, good evening, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is AJ. I'm one of the pastors here at Evergreen. I'm the pastor to students. Used to pastor some of you guys. Sometimes I still do, just because you guys need it. No, I'm just kidding. It's because I love you. Hey, so thanks for letting me come talk to you guys tonight. I love being a part of Reach, a part of the ministry here. And so we're going to jump right in. And can you guys guess where we're going to be tonight? Yeah, we're going to be in 1 Samuel. Imagine that. First, plot twist, not kidding, are kidding. 1 Samuel 24. 1 Samuel 24. So tonight we're going to talk about sometimes in order for us to have restoration, we've got to take a risk. And that's just the way it is. And maybe that risk will be humbling ourselves. Sometimes that risk is doing something uncomfortable. Sometimes that risk is just doing things that don't make sense. But regardless, if we desire restoration, there are times in our life where God is going to challenge us to risk something in our lives in order to find that. And so there's a good chance that there are many of us in this room who desire restoration, whatever that looks like. Maybe that's restoration in a relationship with the Lord and needing to bring ourselves to our knees and come before Him and repent of some of the stuff going on in our lives and just, re-upping our commitment to Him and just saying, like, God, I want to get back on the same page. For some of us, restoration may be a relationship with a friend or a family member. Whatever restoration is for you, think about that tonight as we talk about this story of David and Saul. So, as you know, we're going through 1 Samuel, and so tonight we're picking up in this moment where David is still on the run from Saul. Saul is after David. Can you remember why? Anybody? Yeah, man, David has just been doing all the things right, and Saul has been doing all the things wrong. Saul's not feeling it. Saul doesn't like how many people love David, and so he's going to go after David, and everybody's kind of like, hey, David, heads up, here's what's about to happen. And if not somebody like giving him a way to peace out, God controls the situation, or God gets him out of the situation of whatever's going on. So tonight, they finally meet again, and we're going to see what happens. Think to yourself for a moment, the funniest person you know. Okay? Some people are like, Chad, the guy over there, the bald, red-faced guy. Yeah. So a lot of us have one of those people in our lives. There's a guy I grew up with. I won't say his name, but my little brother will know who he is. There's a guy I grew up with. This guy was the funniest guy that I knew. He could, without even trying, he could get me just on the floor laughing uncontrollably just by being himself. This guy had a laugh that was just so contagious. Just by him laughing at something stupid, you found yourself laughing way harder than him, right? We all have like friends like that we love to be around them. They're hilarious. So this friend of mine, we met in middle school. We were friends all through middle school, friends through high school. And then something happened in college. There's the situation where he had moved out on his own and he's doing, the bachelor life, and he's trying to get all his bills paid and learn to be an adult. And something happened where his credit card was canceled because somebody had gotten a hold of his numbers, right? And so he cancels his credit card. Well, now his phone's getting ready to be turned off. And so he came to me and he said, hey, AJ. He said, I need a favor from you. He said, if I give you, it was like $95. He's like, if I give you $95, can I use your card to pay my phone bill? Great friend of mine. I've known the guy since middle school. I was like, yeah, man, no problem. Like, that's fine. Let's do this. And so he gives me the cash. I go put it in my bank account, give him my card. Actually, he lets me do it. So I get on his account. I type in all my info. I see the total. I hit submit. Everything's good. No big deal, right? Month later goes by, and I go to check my account, and I'm like $160 in the negative. And I'm like, what? That's not right. Can anybody relate? You don't have to raise your hand. We're all poor, right? Just kidding. So I check my account, and I'm like $160 negative. I'm like, what is going on? This isn't right. So I go and I look, and what happened I had like enough money for like two small bills, like a $30 bill, $40 bill. And so I had enough money to cover those two bills. So I was like, okay, I'm going to like, when you like let your bank account get to $2, that was my plan. And I was on track to at least stay in the positive. But what happened is when that next bill came around for his bank or for his phone, they hit my account. So they try to go get his $95, but I didn't have quite enough to do that, so it puts me in the negative. Then my two bills come and try to get out, and so then like they make my account worse. Then I get all these overdraft fees and all this stuff happen. So now I'm looking at my bank account, and I'm like, almost $150 in the negative. I'm like, crud, this is not okay. So I call him up, I explain what happened. He's like, oh, yeah. Like, give me a couple hours. I got you covered. I'm like, all right, cool. I wait. I hear nothing. So I'm trying to call him, doesn't pick up. I try to text him, doesn't reply. I wait a day or two, nothing. So I call him, I text him. I call him, I text him. And I'm like, man, like, I'm not mad at you, bro. I was like, just give me the 95, I'll take care of the rest. Like, I'll take care of the overdraft fees. Like, this is stupid. Like, this is not a reason for us to stop communicating. And so continue back and forth, and we literally stopped communicating for 2 years. Like, this friendship dropped off over a $95 phone bill. And at one point, I call him, I leave a voicemail, and I said, buddy, I said his name. I said, man, this is not worth a phone bill. I said, I don't care about the phone bill. I care about my relationship with you. Call me back. Like, it's not a big deal. Don't be embarrassed. Just call me back so we can hash this out. And he never did. And I know it's because he's incredibly embarrassed, right? Like, he did not mean for that to happen. He was overwhelmingly embarrassed. He knew he didn't have the money to make things right. And so for him, the way he was taught, I guess, growing up, was you can't handle a situation like that. You just peace out. And too many times in this culture, that's what we're told to do, or that's what we're encouraged to do, right? If things just aren't in our best interest, or if things aren't the way we think they should be, we peace out instead of trying to seek restoration. And so again, tonight, we're talking about restoration, and I want you guys to be thinking about what is it in your life that God may be encouraging you to restore, whether it's a relationship or whatever that looks like. So as we look at this story, I'm going to give you number one, and then we'll take a look at our passage. Number one, if you're taking notes, is this: a life spared. The first thing we see is a life spared. So again, we see David is on the run. Saul is coming to get him, okay? David has a following at this point. I believe, if I remember right, he had roughly over 400 kind of in his following, or, people that were supporting him. And so he has some of his guys with him, and they go into this cave, right? And so here's where we pick up. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness near En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 of Israel's fit young men and went to look for David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. When Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went in to relieve himself. Okay, real quick, let me just let you know, relieve himself does not mean use the restroom, okay? The Hebrew in that is basically to rest his feet, if you will. So normally, I'm a student pastor, so I have to tell the kids these things or they giggle. Okay, so I'm just used to that. Anyways, all right. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave, so they said to him, look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemy over to you so you can do with him whatever you desire. Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, I swear before the Lord, I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. So there's kind of a lot going on here, but the first thing we see is a life spared. Whose life are we talking about? Saul's life. So we see Saul, he is going after David for the complete wrong reasons, right? He's in the middle of something, doing the wrong thing with the wrong motives. So in the midst of all this travel and trying to hunt down David, he's like, all right, I'm going to go rest. And so he sees this cave, and he says, I'm going to go rest in this cave. So he walks into the cave. Here's what we are taught through history and science is we're seeing this story, and because this is a dark cave, as he goes in, he can see about 4 paces in front of himself. So he walks in, and he can only see just a few feet in front of himself as he goes in there to rest. But the way that this works is if you're in the cave, as long as you can see the entrance, you can see anything from the entrance to where you are. If you turn around, it's going to be pitch black. But if you are looking at the outside of the cave, you can see anything in front of you. So imagine, right? David's sitting there with all his guys behind him, and they're sitting there in the very back of the cave, and here walks in Saul, the one person they're running from, the one person that wants to kill their guy, and David's there with all his boys behind him, and it's like, yo, there's the guy that wants to kill you. Like, let's do this thing, right? And so he's sitting there, and he sees him. And in that moment, he's faced with, am I going to respond through impulse? Am I going to respond through fear, knowing that this is the man that's here to kill me? That the only reason this man is here right now is because he's on his way to hunt me down? In that moment, he's challenged. Am I going to respond with self-control or not? Sometimes we are blinded by our decisions, and they when they are clear to everyone else. So as we see this mistake that Saul makes, he puts himself in danger because all he's thinking about is, I got to hunt down David. He's not thinking about, like, what are the dangers in this cave, right? And so he puts himself here in this darkness where he can't really see anything, not understanding the danger that's there, but yet everybody else inside the cave can see the light. And sometimes we put ourselves in danger because we're so focused on the negative that we're trying to get done. But God is bringing mercy to us, and we don't see what's happening. We see that with how David responds to this opportunity, right? David didn't respond with an opportunity or he didn't respond with killing the man that's there to hunt him down, but instead he responds in mercy and grace. So in that moment, Saul decides he's going to rest in that cave. I imagine he lays down, possibly even falls asleep. And David goes over, probably takes out a knife of some sort, and he could have just, right, got it done. But he doesn't do that. He cuts off a corner of his robe. We find out later why. And in that moment, God was even protecting Saul in the midst of his evil, in the midst of his sin, in the midst of doing what was wrong. God was at work in Saul's life, even when Saul didn't realize it. But ultimately, we know that in doing so, God is protecting David. Because as PJ has been teaching you guys over the last few months, and as we're going to continue to look at as we go through this book, is this is all about God protecting David as David continues to respond as a godly man. But again, let's focus for a second on this response that David has in this moment. Think of the last time that you were faced with an opportunity to respond in the heat of the moment. What did you do? Just think about that. Maybe it's like the last time you were tempted with something, the last time somebody said something bad about you, the last time somebody smacked you in the face. I don't know, right? Like what's the last time where someone did something or something was happening and you were faced with an option to respond right there in the heat of the moment? What did you do? A few months ago, my wife and I, a lot of you know this story if you follow me on social media. A few months ago, my wife and I were on a date, and we're at Olive Garden. And I'm sitting there, and we're getting ready to get our food, and there's this lady, like, walking around the restaurant looking just kind of shady. And she's, looking for somebody, and I'm not really thinking anything of it. I was like, she's kind of weird. Where's my pasta, right? Like, I'm just ready to eat. And I'm a guy, so, that's where my mind is. So my wife, being, a mom now, so I imagine she has, spidey senses, right? She's like, something's not right about this woman. So she's kind of watching this woman do her thing. Well, we're sitting at a 4-person table across from each other, and then next to us was another couple at a 4-person table sitting across from each other eating dinner. And so the woman goes behind my wife, and then goes behind the chair of the couple next to us, and as she does, she just takes her finger and slips the purse right off the back of the chair and begins to leave. And my wife looks at me and says, that woman just stole that other woman's purse. And all I said was, are you sure? Because I didn't see it. I said, are you sure? She said, positive. And I was like, good enough for me. And I stood up, and I started going after her. And as I did, I look at the guy, and I'm like, yo, she got your wife's purse. And so I walk over there, and she's getting ready to walk out of the exit. And I go like this, and I get in front of her, and she's looking up at me. She was a little woman. She's not very intimidating or anything. She just is looking up at me with 2 purses. That's weird. Why do you have 2 purses, lady? So she's looking at me with 2 purses, And I just grabbed the purse out of her hands. And of course, like my adrenaline's pumping and stuff. So I get the purse out of her hands. And I was like, you can't, I said, you can't steal this. I don't know why those are the words that came out of my mouth, something like that. I don't know what to say. Like, you're a thief. Like, go to jail. I don't know what to say. I'm not a cop. So I just take it. And I was like, you can't steal this. This isn't yours. And I look over, and the guy's just said, like, the guy's bigger than me, whose wife purse just got taken. And he's just standing there like, doesn't know what's going on. He's like he doesn't know what to do. So I take the purse from the lady, and I said, is this your wife's? And he's just like, so I give him the purse, and instead of taking it and being like, call the police, she just tried to steal my wife's purse, which is what I would have done. He was like, and he just walked off and like went back to dinner. And I was like, this is not okay. And so in that moment, I look at the guy behind the host stand, because we're like at the entrance at this point, and I look at this guy, the manager's like beginning to walk up because there's a scene. And I look at the host, and I was like, you gonna call the police? And he's like, oh, yeah, like looking for the phone. First time he's ever used it. So he's like looking for the phone. He's calling the police. The manager walks over, and I'm like, she just tried to steal another woman's purse, and everyone here saw it, and all the hostesses and waitresses and everybody's like, yeah, we saw it. And so the woman's like, excuse me, and tries to go around me, and I'm like standing in front of her. I'm like, no, ma'am, like you can't leave. Like you just tried to commit a crime. You have to wait till the police get here. I'm not going to get into the rest of the story because that's not the point of this story. Long story short, me and my wife got free Olive Garden, and she got arrested, all right? So that's it. That's the end of it. She didn't even get arrested for stealing the purse. I don't know what she got. Yeah, so apparently some stuff went down with the police when they got there. I don't know, but all I know is I got a free meal. But here's the deal. In that moment, when my wife said that, I was faced with a reaction, with this impulse reaction. What am I going to do? Well, I'm proud that my impulse reaction was to find justice in the middle of a wrongdoing. And I don't think necessarily I did anything wrong in that moment. I made sure the woman got her purse back, made sure that the police got there and handled the situation, and I got out, right? But there's times when people could have responded to that differently. What I'm trying to get you to think about is in these moments where our adrenaline is going and we're faced with like, do I do the right thing or do I not? What do we tend to do? Do we tend to go towards the right thing? Do we tend to have self-control and to do the godly thing? Or do we tend to just go with whatever our minds and our bodies tell us to do? Because I tell you what, if you're not walking with the Lord daily, if you're not spending time in God's word on a regular basis, if you're not getting into the word until the word is into you, there's a really good chance that when the world starts knocking at your door, you have no problem answering it. And you're going to let the world walk right in and do whatever it wants in your home. Right? Because you have no locks. Like, you're just doing your thing, and you're like, what's up, world? Like, come on in. What, you want to drink, right? Like, we're just letting the world do whatever it wants to in our lives because, again, we're not getting into the word till the word's getting into us. We're not allowing ourselves to be having this filter, this Jesus filter in our life. But if we're spending time with God every single day and we're faced with a moment, a heat of the moment situation, whether it's we're alone with a guy, alone with a girl, right? We're in that heat of the moment. Do we cross these boundaries? Do we not cross these boundaries? If it's that moment of like, hey, do I take the drink? Do I not take the drink? Do I gossip? Do I not gossip? In those moments where we're tempted to do the worldly thing, if we're with Jesus, we're walking as a godly man or a godly woman, just as David is a godly man. We will do things that don't make sense but ultimately bring God glory. And that's what happens in this moment. David does something that doesn't make sense, but it ultimately brings God glory. He is completely justified, and I'm sure all of you would agree, he is completely justified in that moment to kill Saul. Because he's there with like him and like maybe 400, 500 people. Saul's there with what? 3,000? 3,000 of Israel's fit young men there to kill him? In that moment, he could have been justified. But see this. David desires restoration over justification. David desires restoration over justification. He doesn't care that he's justified in that moment to kill Saul. And sometimes with us, we think as long as we're justified in this decision, well, at least I'm not doing this, right? I can cross this line or this boundary, or I can gossip about this thing, or I can kind of get into this thing that doesn't please God because at least I'm not a murderer, right? We always go to like the most extreme thing. Like at least I'm not a drug addict, or at least I'm not like selling drugs or what. Like we go to like, at least I'm not I don't know. I'm not going to go crazy. But we always do that. That's where our mind goes because we're trying to justify those decisions that we're trying to make. But understand that justification doesn't mean jack, especially when it's not what the Lord wants. And in this moment, God wanted one thing and one thing only. He wanted restoration between David and Saul. And David could see that and understand that even in the moment where it didn't make sense to his men. Because his men was like, yo, God's like laying this up for you. He like placed them on the tee. Knock it out of the park. Let's do this thing. Let's get out of here. And David had control. He had control in that moment. Here's number 2. Or here's a quote I want you to write down. Our heart is reflected in our response in the heat of the moment. We are to respond with self-control, not impulse. We are to respond with self-control and not impulse. In this moment for David, self-control looked like grace instead of fear. Right? Because I'm sure he was dealing with fear. Why? He's been on the run for like a fat minute. And now the guy who's been putting him on the run, who's making his life, quite frankly, a living hell, he decided instead of ending this, I'm going to show grace. I'm going to have self-control instead of responding in impulse. And we need to be sure that we can say the same thing. Why? Because we're walking with Jesus. And we truly believe that the Holy Spirit is going to give us discernment in those moments. Even when our adrenaline's pumping, even when it doesn't make sense to those around us, just like it didn't make sense to all David's guys. Number 2, we see a plea for righteousness. Let's see what happens next, starting in verse 8, going to verse 15. After that, David got up, went out of the cave, and called to Saul, "My lord, the king." When Saul looked behind him, David knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift a hand against my Lord," as in Saul, "since he is the Lord's," as in God's, "anointed. Look, my father, look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Recognize that I've committed no crime or rebellion. I haven't sinned against you, even though you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord take vengeance on you for me. But my hand will never be against you. As the old proverb says, wickedness comes from wicked people. My hand will never be against you. Who has the king of Israel come after? What are you chasing after? A dead dog, a single flea? May the Lord be judge and decide between you and me. May he take notice and plead my case and deliver me from you." So the reason I say a plea for righteousness, because David understands in this moment he wants what is right in the eyes of the Lord. For us to live righteous lives is for us to be in right standing with God. And he knew that this relationship, restoration, would be righteousness before the Lord, because he knew that this is what God wanted. That's why he had self-control in the cave. So this is a plea of restoration. This is a plea for righteousness in this relationship. He said, look what could have happened. I'm pleading with you. Don't do this. Don't kill me. Look what I could have done. And look how God has been on my side. But I didn't do it. He's pleading for restoration. He's pleading for righteousness. We see in this moment that David was vulnerable. In order to seek out this righteousness, in order to seek out this restoration, he had to bring himself to be vulnerable. How? Because he yells out to Saul, and then he says he knelt down before him. Like in that moment with Saul, all of the anger that Saul has, I mean, he's got to be pretty heated and pretty freaked out with the situation. That's why he's got 3,000 dudes with him. Like, he didn't even have to let David finish a word. When he turned around and saw that it was David, he could have pulled out a sword and got it done and been over with, right? Because that's what this whole thing's about, was him chasing him down. It was about Saul chasing David down, so he could have just got this over with. And again, I'm sure that was a thought in David's mind. But David allows himself to be humble, and he kneels down and gives respect to Saul. He humbles himself. Sometimes we are waiting for God to show up, and we want him to do it on our terms. But are we willing to be vulnerable in the season that we're in? Are you right now in a season where you're waiting for God to do something? And if you are you waiting for him to answer your season on your terms, or are you willing to humble yourself? Are you willing to do things that don't make sense to the people around you, even the people that support you? Yeah, that's strange, right? These were the people that followed David. These were the people that supported him. They were like, hey, kill him. He said, I'm not going to do it. Sometimes living for Jesus doesn't make sense. But man, is it worth it? Because all of a sudden we find ourselves living a life of righteousness. We find ourselves being this example of Jesus that not a lot of people get to see in their life. Especially when we have these opportunities to show grace and to show humbleness to people that don't follow Jesus. Nothing in God's word says that we only have to be humble when it comes to us being humble to another believer, right? Or that we only have to forgive other believers, or we only have to show grace to other believers. These are some of the moments where God is most magnified in our lives. When we find ourselves being humbled, we find ourselves pleading for forgiveness or restoration, especially with those who aren't listening to God. Because I'll tell you what, Saul right now, with the way that he's acting, the things that we've been reading about him, he's definitely not doing it. He's definitely not being a godly man. And yet, David is still pleading for restoration and pleading for righteousness in this relationship. And again, David desires restoration over the justification of what he could have done. And he explains that in verse 10. In verse 10, he says, you can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you, and I said, I won't lift a hand against my Lord, talking about Saul, since he is the Lord's, talking about God's anointed. He didn't care if he was justified to kill him because he wanted to bring God glory. And he knew that it was God's desire for this relationship to be restored in this moment, and he was listening. We see in verses 9 through 11, David explains his actions. And David, like in most of our cases, responded in a way that didn't make much sense. He showed grace when grace wasn't even asked for. And there are some times that we are to show grace, we're to show mercy, we're to give forgiveness even when it's not asked for. Like, it's one thing for someone to wrong us and maybe, just kind of write us out of their life, to wrong us and move on, and then now we're feeling really hurt and all of this. It's another for someone to wrong us and then chase us down with 3,000 men to end our lives. I don't know about you. I've never had to deal with that. I don't know, maybe you have. But for him to have to deal with something like that and still respond in this way, man, this guy walked with Jesus. And I only hope and pray that in the heated moments in my life, when I'm faced with these kind of things, that I would do the same thing. We see that David trusts the Lord, especially there at the end. He said, may the Lord judge between me and you. He said, I trust that when God looks at Saul and God looks at David, that God's going to see a man of God in myself. And I'm going to trust that the Lord's going to take care of me. And I'm going to trust that the Lord's going to deliver me from your hand. And now the ball is in Saul's court. Anything could happen in this moment, right? Like, his life could be ended. David's life could be ended. Saul could be totally chill. David is never promised Saul's reaction. David doesn't do all this knowing I know if I do these things, then, Saul's going to be all chill about it. Probably not. That thought probably never even crossed his mind, knowing that 3,000 men were coming to kill him. He was never promised that things were going to work out well. But that didn't matter because he trusts God. He trusts God even though it was probably really hard to trust him in this moment. Even though there probably looked to not be a way out. If 3,000 men are coming to kill him, he probably is not seeing a way out. But he's saying, even then, I'm going to trust God in this situation. If you're in the middle of a situation right now and you just don't see a way out, you don't see a way for God to show up, you don't see how God's going to restore things in your life, let me tell you, he's at work even in this moment. We just got to trust him. And you know what? I'm not saying that as soon as you trust him, God's going to make it all better, right? Or in a week, it's going to be better. Or in a month, it's going to be better. Or in a year, it's going to be better. Because sometimes the way God answers isn't what we think he's going to answer. We just got to trust him. Regardless, we got to trust him. Number 3, we do see in this story, between these two in this moment, we see a relationship restored. So God showed up, and the way that Saul responds is a relationship restored. Let's wrap up our story here. Verse 16. When David finished saying these things to him, Saul replied, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Then Saul wept out loud and said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have done what is good to me, though I have done what is evil to you. You yourself have told me today what good you did for me. When the Lord handed me over to you, you didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him go unharmed? May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done for me today. Now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David swore to Saul. Then Saul went back home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. So we do see that this relationship was restored. Here's what we don't know. We don't know why Saul responds the way he does, okay? We don't know if Saul is responding because, what David said was just the perfect thing. It touched his heart, and he wept, and he genuinely has love, and he genuinely appreciates and is filled with overwhelming thankfulness, right? Like, we don't know if, like, it's truly him responding to this grace and this mercy that David showed him. And so he's responding saying, thank you for showing me that grace. Thank you for showing me that forgiveness when I didn't deserve it, and I want to give it back. But here's the thing. It's possible that Saul is responding this way out of fear, right? It's possible that he's responding this way because he walks out of the cave. I'm sure his men are now there. And then David walks out. I'm sure his guys follow him out. Like, this could get ready to go down, right? Like, a battle could happen right here. But instead, David gets down, and David, in essence, becomes the bigger man, right? By him kneeling down, face down, giving reverence to Saul and saying, I'm going to honor you, and I could have killed you, but I didn't. And he's kneeling before him. Saul could be like, oh, man, all eyes on me. What am I going to do in this moment? Yeah, I'll tell you what, man, I appreciate you. Like, thank you so much for doing that, right? Because maybe he doesn't want to continue to be looking like the tail end of this situation like he continues to do, right? We've seen in story after story, and we're going to continue to see, that David continues to build up his reputation as a man of God. We've seen that all the way up to this point, and we continue to see Saul be an idiot time after time after time. So in this moment, he's like, okay, do I continue to make myself look like an idiot? Let me try something different. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to accept this apology, and I'm going to make it look all official, and I'm going to cry, and I'm going to do all this stuff. Again, we don't know. All we know is that Saul is very wishy-washy, right? He may be bipolar. We don't know. We just know this dude is out of control. But regardless, here's what we do know. Ultimately, in the midst of this story, we talk about a life being spared here, and at first glance, we think it's Saul's life being spared by David. I don't believe that that's really the life that we need to focus on being spared. I believe what we need to focus on is the fact that David's life was spared by Saul. Why? Because David was a man of God. Regardless of why Saul responded the way he did, ultimately what we see here is God has protected David by being a man of God, a follower of God, by responding in a situation with humbleness, responding in the situation with self-control. This is the life spared. He took this risk to spare Saul's life, to find restoration in this relationship. The restoration was found. But again, whose life was really spared in this moment? I believe it was David's. I believe God desired for David to show God's glory in this situation. Here's the deal. We live in a culture that tells us, look out for yourself, right? Like that's the filter our world tells us to look through. That's the filter the world tells us to act through. That's the filter the world tells us to speak through. It's all about looking out for myself, and are people wronging me, and it's all about me, self. And I believe as believers, we got to stop that. And the filter that we need to be thinking through and speaking through and acting through is, how will this represent my Jesus and the reputation of my Jesus, right? Because too many times, the way that we respond and knee-jerk reactions in the heat of the moment without thinking, the way we respond a lot of time in those moments really paints an ugly picture of the God that we follow. Because too many times we don't have self-control. Too many times we act just like the world. Too many times we jump right into the sin. We jump right into the gossip. We jump right into the things that are ungodly. And when we do that, we are throwing God's name all over the mud when we place that label Christian on ourselves, and we have no desire to truly live by it. So instead of like looking through this filter of it's all about me, I'm going to respond to these things dependent on how it's going to work out for me. That's not what David did. David said, how is this going to work out for my God? If I respond this way, am I going to bring glory to myself, or can I ultimately bring glory to God? Can God be glorified in how I respond to the situation? And that's what I want to challenge you, is as you go through situations in your life and relationships in your life and temptations in your life, and you're faced with those moments of how am I going to respond right now in the heat of the moment? think to yourself, what is my reaction going to say about the reputation of my Jesus? Is this going to be God's light in the midst of darkness, and how I respond? Right? Like our pastor's been joking around about using that hashtag. What is it? Shine like stars? Shine like stars in the world. That's what it is. Shine like stars in the world. Because there's a passage in Scripture that talks about us shining like stars in the world in a dark place. Are we willing to live out in our responses that way? Or do we just do whatever our flesh tells us to do? Regardless of Saul's motives in this moment, David is protected by God, and his unfailing obedience is rewarded. And again, sometimes the rewards that we see aren't always what we want. They're not always what we expect. They don't always come when we want them to come. There may be right now rewards in your life that you're benefiting from a decision you made forever ago that you don't even realize. Because they're like our consequences continue to build on top of each other. So decisions that you maybe have made years ago in your life, you're still walking through consequences of those decisions, good or bad. Hopefully good. Hopefully not too many bad ones, right? But regardless, those things will continue to trickle down in our life. So, young adults, my challenge to you, in the heat of the moment in your life, when you're faced with temptation, when you're faced with responding to a situation, do I jump into this or do I live for Jesus? Ask yourself, am I going to respond as a man of God or as a woman of God? And if we're honest, and the answer is, I don't know, or unfortunately for some of us, if the answer is probably not, then why? It's probably because we're not getting into the Word until the Word gets into us. And that sounds super cliche, and that sounds like a pastor talking up on stage, because it is, right? But I'll tell you what, God's Word is alive, and it's powerful. When we apply it to our lives, incredible things happen. It really does. What we spoon feed you up here is just a taste of what God can do when you spend time in His Word. So that's my challenge for you tonight.
What's up, everybody? This is Philip Jackson, pastor young adults at Evergreen Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday evening at 6:30 at Evergreen Church, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. For more information, check out our website, reachtulsa.org. You can connect with us on social media and on Instagram by searching for reach.tulsa. Also, be sure to subscribe to our content for the latest sermons and updates. You can also find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Yeah, wash over us. Bring your glory down.